the Ford School of Public Policy, which is what this building is. I happen to be the Associate Dean of the Ford School, but I'm not talking to you in that capacity. I'm talking to you simply as a professor of international economics. My specialty is international trade and trade theory and trade policy, and I will, as I told some of you apparently by email yesterday, be teaching a course in international trade policy this fall, which I'd be delighted to have you take. Now, it is the economics of international trade policy, and it does have a pretty fair amount of microeconomic theory in it, and using that theory to quantify the effects of trade policies. None of that will come into my talk today. So this is a little misleading as an idea of what my course will be. My course will involve maybe half of the classes will involve using the diagrams and equations of economics to analyze things, and I'm not going to do that today, but I also always teach quite a lot about the institutions, and that is what I'll be talking about today. So I'll get started with that in just a minute, but I'd like to get a sense of who you all are. I think by definition that you're international students, since this is the purpose of the program that you're in right now. I know from this that at least one of you, and maybe more than one of you, are incoming students for the Ford School in the Masters of Public Policy. How many is that true of? So, oh my goodness, Okay, wait a minute. Keep your hands up just a second here. So 3, 6, 7. Wow. Okay. Welcome. Welcome to the Ford School. That's great. I would guess a few of you might be doing the Masters in Applied Economics, because that's usually true. Just you? Okay. Glad to have you in my course as well, if you're interested. And then, so what are the rest? Some of you probably in business? Any doing business school? No? So what are others of you doing that didn't just raise your hand? What? Science. Math. Okay. Master's in or PhD? Oh, okay. I somehow, for some reason, I had assumed it was always master's. Really? Starting as a freshman, so you don't look as young as that would suggest. But yeah. In epidemiology. Wow. Okay. I'm sorry? Okay. Very good. Others? Yeah.
Student of aerospace engineering.
Aerospace engineering. Wow. Okay. So, yeah, some of you are going to do hard things. Masters of Public Policy, of course, is easy. Well, no, the students don't seem to think so. But I always feel that those of you who are doing science and engineering are doing really the demanding things. Okay. Well, let me get started here. What I wanted to talk to you about, this is actually a lecture that I gave in Beijing last month, I guess it was. We have a program here in the Ford School, sort of an exchange program with Renmin University in Beijing. And so every fall we have 2 professors from that university that come here and give a half-semester course each in the Ford School. And occasionally our faculty go over there. We also have a program where a class of students goes over there every spring. So we have an ongoing relationship with them, and that relationship has been going for 10 years. And so we had sort of a 10th year anniversary celebration over there in June, I think it was. And while I was there, they wanted me to give a lecture to their students, so I prepared this for them, and I'm going to present it also to you. I think I had a little more time to talk to them, so I cut out a couple of slides, but as is, it may still be a bit more than I can get through. I may jump over some parts of it to try to be sure. We want to stop at 10, is that correct?
We have actually up until 10:30 maximum.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So whatever suits you in that range.
Well, I have nothing else planned, so I still will try to stop well before 10:30, certainly, because I'd like a chance to get some questions and answers, if possible. Okay, so what I want to talk about is international trade and international trade policy. Trade policy was, to some extent, the institutions were fairly dramatically changed with the creation of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And it went into effect in 1995, as we'll see. And so most of what I was going to talk about today is what's happened with trade policy since then, since 1995. But to put that in context, I will have to start long before that, and I will do that. What has happened in that period? Well, just a brief statement of all of the things that I'm going to talk about. One is international trade itself has grown tremendously. Now, it was growing before 1995, ever since World War II. It continued to grow and perhaps even to accelerate after the creation of the WTO. Tariffs, which are the taxes that constrain trade, those have fallen, but only a little, actually. Most of the reductions in tariffs occurred prior to the WTO, even though in some sense the WTO's purpose is to reduce tariffs. There's other kinds of trade barriers that, which we just call generally non-tariff barriers, any kind of barrier to trade other than a tariff. Those have diminished somewhat over that period, partly because of the WTO. And there have been trade disputes. There have been arguments between countries about trade. And as was intended in the creation of the WTO, these have been taken to that organization for settlement, for resolution. Now, the most notable attempt to actually make any changes in the world under the WTO has been what's called the Doha round. It's a round of negotiations that was decided, that was initiated at a meeting in Doha, Qatar, but the negotiations have been going on in Geneva, Switzerland. That's where these things happen. They started in 2001, and they still are not over, and it looks now like they never will be, like they're going to fail. So that major undertaking of the WTO has not been successful. What's happened instead is free trade agreements. That's what FTAs stands for. Free trade agreements have proliferated around the world, and I definitely want to get to that because that, I think, is the major thing that is going on in the world trading system, the major kind of new thing that is going on these days. Okay, so my plan is to review first a little bit of the history before the WTO and then talk about each of those bullet points a little bit. And then briefly at the end, perhaps try to say something about what will happen in the future. But I'm not very good at forecasting, especially the future. So I probably won't try to say too much about that. Okay, a little bit of history. Even well before World War II, going back centuries really, the most common trade policy that countries have had has been tariffs. Taxing trade at the border. Taxing normally imports coming in. It's possible to tax exports going out, but countries don't usually do that very much. They do occasionally. And tariffs historically have often been very, very high compared to what they are today. I'll show you that in just a minute. Governments control those things, of course, for their own countries, and they raise them and lower them, or historically they have done so for reasons that have to do presumably mostly with politics, although probably occasionally the economics. The last big increase in tariffs was in the 1930s, in the Great Depression, that affected the United States and I think most of the rest of the world, certainly the other industrialized countries. It was led off by what was called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, or tariffs in the United States. Smoot and Hawley were, I presume, I've seen pictures of them, probably a member of the House of Representatives in the U.S. government, in the Congress, and a senator, because typically we have these bills in Congress that get two names attached to them, and it's usually, I think, one from each part of the Congress. Anyway, they put forward this bill to raise tariffs, partly in response to what was beginning to happen of the Great Depression. But many economists and others today would say that these tariff increases made the Great Depression far bigger, far greater than it would otherwise have been. And it was responded to, and this is part of the reason why it had such bad effects, by other countries doing the same thing. So we raised our tariffs, and then the Europeans did too, and that just dried up trade rather dramatically and hurt the economies of the world. Now, this shows before that period, this is going all the way back to 1810, the average levels of tariffs in the United States for about a century, and you can see lots of ups and downs, which is part of my point. But if you look at the numbers and compare them to what tariffs are today are, in the United States, an average of maybe 3 or 4%. Tiny compared to what they were for this entire century, and very tiny compared to what they were for small periods of that time. So the United States historically has been a very high tariff country. We aren't anymore. Ever since World War II, we've been leading the efforts to reduce tariffs. And so now we sort of have a reputation as being a free trade country. But that sure clearly was not always true. In the 19th century, we had very high tariffs and continued to into the 20th century. This is a graph that shows, it overlaps that previous one, and it shows how the tariffs were very high at the end of the 1800s. They came down early in the 20th century, and then they came up again. Now, when they came up, they didn't come up nearly as high as they had before. What we today call the awful Smoot-Hawley tariff of around 1930 was actually nothing compared to what we'd had years before. But it was very high compared to what we had a decade or so before. And that's important. Now, what you can see is, of course, that tariffs have come down pretty steadily ever since the height that they reached, the local height they reached with Smoot-Hawley, and have remained low. Well, this only goes into the 1950s, but they clearly would come down lots more if we could take this on to the present. So that's what tariffs have looked like. Now, the high tariffs that had happened worldwide in the 1930s, there was an effort to fix this. At the end of World War II, actually, there was an effort to fix a lot of things economically, because the period of the 1930s had been so awful that the leaders of the countries that would ultimately win World War II decided to get together and try to create new institutions that would make the world economy a better place than it had been before. They had a meeting at a place called Bretton Woods. That's a small town, I've never been there, in New Hampshire. And the institutions that were created there have since been called, therefore, the Bretton Woods institutions. And those include the International Monetary Fund, which continues to exist today. What it did was try to organize and regulate exchange rates. Exchange rates had done some awful things, or countries had done some awful things with their exchange rates back in the 1930s. And so the IMF was created primarily to try to prevent that, and indeed to oversee a regime of pegged exchange rates. That actually fell apart then in the 1970s, and today we have floating exchange rates amongst the major industrialized countries and their currencies. But the IMF continues to exist today, and nowadays it plays still a very major role in providing financial help to countries that get into financial trouble. That used to be almost exclusively developing countries, but over the last few years they've been very heavily involved with the peripheral countries of the European Union, as Greece and Portugal and Ireland and Cyprus have gotten into trouble. So that's the IMF. That was created then, and it continues to exist. The World Bank is the second Bretton Woods institution that was created then. The World Bank didn't used to be its official name. It was called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And it's still, parts of it are officially called that, but now everybody calls it the World Bank. And it is now a huge collection of international institutions that do different things, but mainly its purpose is to help developing countries. Again, that wasn't actually its purpose when it was created in the 1940s. It was supposed to help Europe recover from World War II. But they did get recovered, and so through most of its history, the World Bank has been there in order to help developing countries. Now, the people that created the IMF and the World Bank also discussed creating something called an international trade organization. Notice it's not the same term. We now have the World Trade Organization, not the international one. So what happened? Well, the countries agreed upon the framework for an ITO, but then it didn't get approved. Basically in the United States, even though we led the push to create the thing, we then couldn't get it through Congress. A familiar story that's happened still today quite often with initiatives. And so it didn't happen. What happened instead, though, because the countries who negotiated the ITO knew it would take, even optimistically, that it would take some years before it could get approved, they created a temporary, they thought, temporary agreement called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to restrict countries, to get countries to agree not to use tariffs and other trade policies to hurt each other until the ITO went into place. Well, the ITO never did go into place, and as a result, this GATT, this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was supposed to be temporary, ended up being the policy framework for trade policy for the next 50 years. And so through a good portion of my career, it was the GATT that we looked to understand what countries could and could not do with their tariffs. Okay, that's what that is saying. What is the GATT? The GATT is of historical interest because it played this role for 50 years, but it is still very much of current interest because when the World Trade Organization was created, it incorporated the GATT. So everything that was the GATT is still the GATT, and it's still just as important as it was before. It's just now a part of the World Trade Organization. So what does it do? Well, one is it is a system of rules for the countries that signed on to it. It was just an agreement. They didn't have to sign on. But for the countries that signed on to the GATT, it was a system of rules about how they could and could not use their trade policies. And it had several features, but the most important one probably was this one I've listed here called the Most Favored Nation Principle, or MFN principle. The Most Favored Nation Principle says that you will give every other country in the agreement, which today is basically every other country in the world because almost every country's in the WTO, you'll give every other country in the agreement as good a treatment, as favorable a treatment, as you give the most favored nation. Okay? So what that would say would be if we're going to charge a 10% tariff on the exports from Canada, we can't charge a higher tariff on the exports from Germany or Mexico or China. We must give everybody that same minimum tariff. Now, immediately you see that and you think, wait a minute, we don't do that, do we? Because we have a whole bunch of free trade agreements where countries levy zero tariffs on the trading partners in those free trade agreements. I'll talk a lot more about that later. Well, the rules of the GATT, and still today the WTO, have an explicit exception for that. You are allowed to negotiate free trade agreements, so you can give better treatment to some countries than to others, but the rule is that you've got to do it on almost everything. Ideally everything, but there's usually some exceptions. And you have to go all the way to zero. So we can't charge a 10% tariff against Canada if we do a 15% one against Germany, but we can and do give a zero tariff. We go all the way to zero in the North American Free Trade Agreement. That's allowed. It's a clear violation of MFN, but it's a permitted violation in these rules. So that's the setup. Now the reason this was a good thing to do, well, there were economic reasons. Charging different tariffs distorts markets, and that's harmful economically. But the more important reason was this. The countries were now, and they knew they were going to do this, they were going to start negotiating with each other, pairwise, initially anyway. So two countries would talk to each other, and they would say, hey, I'd like you to lower your tariff on these products that we care about because we want to export them to you. What can I do for you? And they'll say, the other country will say, well, how about if you lower your tariff on these other products that we want to export to you? So countries would agree bilaterally to lower some of their tariffs, the ones that were of most interest to their exporters. But with this MFN rule, when they did that between two countries, they had to extend that benefit to everybody else. And that was the secret of negotiations that then began under the GATT in the late 1940s to lower tariffs. It all started with countries talking one-on-one to each other, But the deals that they did, because of this MFN principle, were extended to everybody else. And as a result, tariffs came down, down, down. So it's tariffs that were on average maybe 40% ad valorem, that is on the value of the goods, in the late 40s, are today about 4%, about 1/10 of what they were before. And most of that reduction, at least for the industrialized countries, was a result of these negotiations. They were called rounds of trade negotiations that spread their benefits across all the members of the GATT because of this MFN principle. Well, there were a lot of other pieces to the GATT, but one other that I'll mention is there was a mechanism for settling disputes between countries, but it was very, very weak for reasons that I won't go into here, but if you're curious about it, I can tell you. So that didn't work so well. The tariff reducing part worked well, but the business for settling disputes didn't work all that well. Okay, well, there was rounds of negotiations. There were a bunch of them. I'm going to jump over them all. But then the most recent one, and the only one to be initiated after the World Trade Organization was started, which came about as a result of this previous round, by the way, as I said, has not succeeded. So what's happened? Well, tariffs came way down, as I've said. I'm going to jump over a bunch of this. Many developing countries were not members of the GATT early on. In fact, none of them were, I guess, initially. Gradually, over time, more and more of them joined, and to some extent participated in the negotiations, but mainly as a favor to them that they requested, and we, richer countries, gave them. We said, you can join the GATT, but you don't have to participate in the negotiations. You don't have to offer to lower your tariffs. That turns out to have been, I think, very unfortunate, because it meant that tariffs that were actually hindering them stayed high for much longer than they did in the industrialized countries. And eventually, a lot of the developing countries began to realize that and started to lower their tariffs just unilaterally, deciding to do it on their own. So today, developing countries' tariffs are also much lower than they used to be, but they're not as low as the developed country tariffs. The tariff cuts that were accomplished were primarily on the things of export interest to the developed countries, because they were the ones doing the negotiation. So they got reduced on most manufacturers, but not on textiles and apparel, because it was already true early in this period that the textile and apparel industries of rich countries like the United States had shrunk enough. We certainly weren't exporting, and so instead we wanted to keep the tariffs high. So textiles and apparel continued to have high tariffs, and agriculture. Agriculture has been a huge but very special case all along, that many countries, and it seems to be the richer they are, the more they do this, protect their farmers. And so we keep high trade barriers, and we have high subsidies and other things protecting our agriculture. Let me skip over some of the non-tariff barriers, because I'm really going much slower than I meant to. The whole idea was I was going to talk about after the WTO. So what happened here? Okay, here's the growth of trade. This is just using an index that's set at 1 in 1960, but you can see the blue line, the bottom line there, that's the growth in the size of the world economy, GDP. Trade, the red line, as you can see, grew much faster than GDP. And that has been true pretty consistently over the entire period, including since the World Trade Organization went into effect right here. And it looks like trade took off even faster at that point. So yes, world trade has been growing very, very rapidly. Tariffs are at varying levels for different countries. This is a map I found somewhere. The lighter the color, the lower are the tariffs. So tariffs are low in the United States and Europe, and actually in China. They are high and even very high. The dark red is the highest, above 35%. I'm not sure where that is actually in the picture. It must be there somewhere. The gray, I think they just don't have data. That doesn't probably mean very much. So there's a huge difference in the size of the trade barriers, and it's basically between, for the most part, developed and developing countries. The tariffs are much lower in the developed countries. Why did trade grow so fast? Was it because of tariff reductions? Well, no, not really. Tariff reductions, by and large, have stopped happening since the WTO was created. Most of the tariff reductions were negotiated under the GATT. And there's probably been some reductions since then, but not much. What about transportation costs? Have those come down? Well, yeah, to some extent, but not a huge amount. So I don't think that's a big part of the story. What is a big part of the story is what I've called fragmentation. That is, it used to be that a product that you might buy in the store was all made in one place. And that was it. Nowadays, hardly anything is made in just one place. Things are made of parts that come from other places that are in turn made of parts that come from still other places, and often those other places are other countries. So nowadays, we talk about the global supply chain. If you trace back where a product like an iPhone was produced, you'll find it's got pieces from a whole lot of different countries. And every movement of those pieces is trade. So there's much more trade built into an individual product than there used to be. And that's why, I think that's a big part of the reason why trade has been growing. Somebody else was giving a talk once and they showed this slide and I liked it, so I asked them to share it with me. This is a picture of a toy I'd never heard of called Topper the Trick Terrier, and I guess he talks and in fact can respond to questions, sort of like the iPhone supposedly can. How many of you have iPhones? Lots of you. Do you have the newish ones that have the woman inside that talks to you? I tried that once and didn't get much out of it, but the other day I was trying to do something and I must have hit the wrong button and she started talking to me. And I thought, where's that voice coming from? She wasn't helpful. Anyway, this dog apparently talks, but the point is that the pieces are coming from a number of different parts of China, but also from Malaysia, Korea, Taiwan, San Francisco. Not a lot of the U.S. there, but there's a little, and so forth. So that's typical of so many products today. And that's a big part of why trade has grown. Now, I couldn't have done that if tariffs had not come down quite a ways. If you were continuing to levy a 40% tariff on every stage of production, obviously you're not going to source things across many countries because all of those pieces would be subject to tariffs upon tariffs upon tariffs, really, because the input would be taxed the first time it crossed a border, and then once it was built into the product, it would be taxed the next time it crossed a border, and so forth. So the low tariffs are essential for all of this to have happened. In that sense, the reduced tariffs has played a big role, but this fragmentation really only took off in the last decade or two. And I think the much more important reason why it's happened isn't trade policy. It's information technology. If you want to organize a production process across many different parts of the globe, you've got to communicate. You've got to be in touch instantly with your suppliers. I mean, imagine trying to do this back in the days where you had to use sailing ships across the Atlantic Ocean. It simply wouldn't work. But nowadays, with the internet, we have, and other long-distance communications, we have instant communication, and that's crucial for this process. The speed of transport is also somewhat important, clearly, because many of these small products, anyway, will be shipped by plane rather than boat, so that they can get where they're going in a matter of hours rather than a matter of days. Okay, so what's happened since 1995? Well, those non-tariff barriers that I kind of skipped over were made, some of them were made illegal in the WTO. We had a bunch of quotas on textiles and apparel. Those were also agreed upon to be eliminated with the WTO, and they were, in fact. The plan was to allow 10 years to get rid of them, but by 2005, in fact, they were gotten rid of. So a number of non-tariff barriers have been eliminated or reduced substantially under the WTO. Tariffs haven't fallen so much, but some NTBs have. On the other hand, there's been somewhat increased use of some other non-tariff barriers, and one that comes to mind is anti-dumping. Most countries of the world today have laws that say if imports are coming in at an unfairly low price, then you can respond to them. That's called dumping. And you can respond to them with a tariff, an anti-dumping duty. Those are being used more and more over time by both the rich and the poor countries of the world. The WTO, yes?
What is
Okay. NTB is non-tariff barrier. So any barrier to trade other than a tariff. An example of that is the VER, which I skipped over in the previous slide, so I skipped over it again, but it's a voluntary export restraint, VER, voluntary export restraint. And we don't have them anymore, but back in the 1980s especially, that was a tool that we used a lot to restrict our trade specifically with Japan in the automobile industry and with Japan and other countries in the steel industry. And what it meant was that we, importing countries, would persuade the exporting country to limit its own exports to us. That was a so-called voluntary export restraint. But those were made illegal under the WTO, and for the most part have remained gone. We don't have them anymore. Okay? Yeah, thank you for asking. I mentioned that under the GATT, international disputes were handled but not terribly well. Well, the WTO much improved its dispute settlement system, and I think it's been working quite well. Trade disputes inevitably happen between countries, and nowadays, almost all of them are taken by the countries to the WTO for settlement. It acts sort of like a court. We don't have time to go into how it actually functions, but it does function. And it does succeed by and large. Now, I would mention, this just is a thing about the process, but if a dispute goes to the WTO and a country loses and is told, hey, you're doing something wrong and you must stop doing it, can we make a country stop doing things? No, we cannot. Countries are sovereign nations. So if they are misbehaving and the WTO says they are misbehaving, and they don't want to change their behavior, then what happens? Well, that's what's unique about the WTO. It's this last line here. If a country will not change its illegal behavior, in effect, then other countries are authorized by the WTO to levy tariffs against that country's exports. Something that would otherwise be totally illegal under the WTO, and indeed getting rid of tariffs was supposed to be the point of the WTO, but it actually uses tariffs as the tool, as the ultimate tool for making countries behave. Now, the hope, of course, is that that will be a strong enough tool that they won't misbehave, or that they will correct their misbehavior once the WTO finds against them. And for the most part, it works, but it doesn't always work. So on occasion, the WTO has, in fact, authorized countries to levy tariffs against other countries in retaliation for behavior that has been decided in the WTO to be illegal. And not a lot of that has happened, but some of it has happened. Now, there's a lot of other things going along here, and part of it is conversations between the countries. So the complaining country or group of countries will have conversations, negotiations with the misbehaving country, and they might come to a settlement, and they might agree to something that will resolve the case. An example of this that is horrible, in my opinion, and in most people's opinion, is that some years back, Brazil brought a case to the World Trade Organization complaining about U.S. subsidies to agriculture. As you probably know, the United States government has a long history of paying subsidies to farmers. Typically, well, there's a whole lot of products that we do this for. Some of them are ones that were not competitive, and so we do this to keep the farmers alive when they otherwise, well, they wouldn't die, but they would have to go into another line of work because of competition from imports. But bizarrely, we also pay huge subsidies to farmers that are very efficient, very productive. So our corn and soybean farmers in the vast plains of the Midwest, which we're not very far from here, they're incredibly efficient and productive. In spite of that, our government pays them a lot of money, which lowers their costs even further. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's a terrible policy, but politically it seems to be impossible to get rid of. Brazil brought a case against us and won. The WTO decided against the United States. It said, okay, these subsidies are illegal. You've got to get rid of them. Well, we weren't about to do that. We didn't do that. So what happened? Well, it wasn't retaliation. It was a negotiation between us and Brazil. And we are now paying Brazil a whole bunch of money. We're paying them a lot of dollars to say, okay, we're not going to get rid of our subsidies, but how about if we buy you off? We're bribing them, basically, but it's legal in the system. Now, of course, that doesn't help any of the other countries that have to compete with our subsidized farmers, not at all. But it satisfied Brazil. It's just a horrible example of international policies, but given that that happened, then Brazil didn't ask for the chance to use tariffs. They were happy because they're getting all these dollars. So there's some weird things that happen here, but by and large, and for at least, I would say the vast majority of disputes that go to the WTO are either settled in a more sensible way than that one, or lead to changes in the behavior of the offending countries, and only very occasionally do they lead to that retaliation to enforce them. Okay, well, there we go. Here's a chart of the number of disputes that have gone to the WTO since 1995. You see there were quite a few early on. I think that's probably because countries knew that the WTO was going to be coming, and so they held off on some disputes until they could have this mechanism. They therefore diminished. There was an uptick in 2012. I have no idea where this is going, whether we're going to see more or fewer cases. But my judgment of all of this is that it's working well, by and large. And it's really the big reason for being glad we have the World Trade Organization, is this dispute settlement system. The Doha round. As I said, the Doha round started in 2001, started in the city of Doha. It claimed that its objective was going to be to help developing countries. And indeed, so much so that the official name of it is the Doha Development Agenda. Now, that was probably an unfortunate choice because it was going to be a round of trade negotiations and not a round of talking about how can we help developing countries. It was going to be how can we reduce trade barriers, just like all the other trade negotiations. But the idea was we're going to try to do it in a way that will be particularly beneficial for developing countries. And that's why they gave it that name. But it was incredibly hard, and probably inevitably it was hard. The things they were trying to do, things like getting trade barriers into developing countries reduced, because we at least believe that's in their interest, but also getting rid of, or at least reducing, the subsidies that the United States and Europe pay to agriculture. That was a big part of the negotiations. Indeed, that was the big trade-off. The developing countries wanted the rich countries to get rid of their subsidies, specifically on products that developing countries would be able to export. And we wanted increased access into their markets, getting them to reduce their tariffs further than they already had. Well, both sides have been stubborn, and neither side has given an inch, really, in over 12 years of these negotiations. And so it hasn't happened. An interesting thing was that the developing countries, for the first time in these negotiations, began to operate as a group. And that group was given the name of the Group of 20. This is an unfortunate name because there's another Group of 20 that includes rich countries for other purposes. I'm walking out of your thing here. But in any case, this is the name that's still gets given to it. It's major developing countries, led pretty much by Brazil, but including quite a number of others, India, China, and so forth. Currently, in spite of its name of 20, it has 23 countries. Another reason why it's a bad name. And beginning in 2003, this group of developing countries was conferring among themselves and speaking with one voice in the negotiations. I thought at the time, and I still think that this is a very good thing. The world trading system has been dominated previously way too much by the United States and Europe, the rich countries. For the developing countries to have a substantial and offsetting role in the negotiations, I think was very good. Unfortunately, it has meant that the negotiations reached an impasse, and they've never managed to come to any kind of a deal. Oh yeah, here's a map that shows where those group of 20 countries are. I don't know the reason for the different colors. Somebody else made the map. Well, here is a little bit of a history of the problems that they've had, and basically almost every bullet point there is when the negotiations faltered one way or another. And the most recent thing was in 2011, where there was an effort by a group of 5 countries. G4 is up here, and then they added China. They tried to come to some sort of an agreement that would allow this thing to move on, but they failed. They are scheduled to have another meeting in December of this year in Bali. I got a chance to go to that. But unfortunately, I'd already committed to another conference at exactly the same days that I can't get out of. And I don't really want to get out of. I was excited about the other conference, but I would love to go to Bali. Anyway, they're hoping they're going to salvage something at that meeting. I rather doubt they will succeed at all, but even if they do, it will not be much. So I think basically the Doha round, well, I'm going to just go with that. It's dead. It hasn't been buried yet, but it's not going to accomplish anything. And that's very sad. The history of the world trading system since World War II has, at least until the WTO came along, been one of multilateral trade liberalization, meaning all the countries of the group were lowering their tariffs through rounds of negotiation on everybody else because of MFN. And that succeeded in lowering tariffs dramatically from what they were before. It permitted this tremendous growth of international trade and the benefits that I think, and most economists think, the world has enjoyed from all of that. It was fantastic. But we're not able to do it anymore, apparently. So what are we doing instead? Well, that's the thing. The thing we're doing instead are free trade agreements. An FTA, a free trade agreement, is an agreement between 2 or more countries where they agree to go to 0 tariffs on everything they trade with each other, or at least almost everything. The explicit rule in the GATT and the WTO is that you must reduce to 0 almost all of your tariffs. Ideally, it would be all, but there's always exceptions in negotiations, right? And so countries typically identify sensitive sectors that they either exclude completely from the negotiations, or they have much smaller tariff reductions, or they phase them in over a long period of time. So most FTAs have a few sensitive sectors that are exceptions. But for the most part, it's lowering the tariffs all the way. When they do this, they don't even talk about the tariffs that they're going to continue to levy on outside countries, okay? And therefore, there's no attempt to coordinate those. There's another kind of trade agreement, a stronger one in some sense, called a customs union. I didn't put on the slide, where in addition to the 0 tariffs amongst yourselves, you also agree to levy a common tariff on each product. All the different members are going to levy the same tariff against outsiders. That's what the European Union is and does. That's what Mercosur, the trade agreement amongst Argentina, Brazil, or Uruguay, Paraguay, and I guess now Venezuela, aspires to be. I don't think they've achieved it, but that was their intent. There's a few examples out there of customs unions, and of course the European Union is a huge example. But aside from that, it's very unusual. Most trade agreements, and as you'll see, there's hundreds of them, are free trade agreements where they keep their tariffs, presumably therefore different tariffs across different countries, against the outsiders. Now that's a problem, because and let me talk about this in the context of the free trade agreement I know best, because you're sitting in it, the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is a trade agreement that went into effect in 1994, so it's fairly old amongst the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So we have zero tariffs on all trade amongst those three countries, all goods trade. But each country has its own, presumably different tariff on imports from, let's say, China or Japan or just about any place, okay? Well, if those tariffs are different, you can pretty quickly see what the incentive is. If you're a Chinese exporter wanting to send refrigerators to the United States, I don't know what our tariffs are, but let's suppose the United States has a 20% tariff on refrigerators and Mexico has a 5% tariff on refrigerators. You'd say, well, okay, I'll export it first to Mexico, pay the 5% tariff, and then just take it across the border tariff-free, right? That's called trade deflection. Well, people weren't stupid. They negotiated these things, and they knew that if they didn't do something about it, that would happen. So free trade agreements always include what are called rules of origin, which, there it is, rules of origin, to prevent that. What that means is that the border between Mexico or Canada and the United States is not just open. Now, of course, we know it's not open for people crossing as well, but this is even for trade. You can't just take goods across the border and not have to deal with a customs officer. You do have to deal with a customs officer because the customs officer, when they see you bring a refrigerator in, they're going to say, wait a minute, where was that made? Where did it originate? If it was made in Mexico, fine, zero tariff. But if it was made outside of Mexico, the United States, or Canada, then the 20% tariff applies. Okay? So all trade still has to go through that process at the border, even inside of a free trade agreement. That's not true in Europe, because they're a customs union. You could cross the border from and I did this actually, from Germany to what you think is France, and there might not even be a sign, but there's certainly no border crossing that you have to stop at where they can check what you're bringing in. And because of that, it turned out my wife and I accidentally went into the Netherlands. We were trying to drive to France, and we got in there and started seeing signs in a funny language and realized, whoops, we got to the wrong country. In Europe, you can do that because they don't do anything at the border. But in a free trade area, you're always going to have border agents checking the products because they are going to levy tariffs if the things didn't originate from inside. Well, that would be fine and fairly simple in this imaginary old world where every product was made just in one place. But nothing is anymore. So that refrigerator, I don't know why I picked that example, coming across from Mexico, yeah, maybe somebody slapped the metal on the outside of it in Mexico, but where did the shelves come from? Where did the motor come from? Where did the, on and on and on. There's so many different pieces, many of which were probably made in other countries these days. And so these rules of origin can't just say it has to have been made here. They have to say what that means. How do we define origin? And they have a bunch of different ways of doing that, and it can get incredibly complicated, usually for very protectionist reasons, actually, in the NAFTA. But the two simplest ways are to specify the fraction of the value that must have gone into the product inside the FTA. And the other way is to use the classifications of products that we have all over the place for defining tariffs, and simply ask, did the pieces, were they in the same classification or do they come from a different classification? And if they come from a different classification, then that's okay. But if they come from the same classification, but were imported from outside, then they'll say, okay, well, this didn't originate here. Anyway, it gets complicated. But these rules of origin mean that these free trade agreements are not nearly as close to being free trade as their name might suggest. Rules of origin can be very, and often are, very, very restrictive. Of course, the other thing about a free trade agreement is that they are lowering tariffs only against some countries, not against all. Okay? When under the GATT, as we lowered our tariffs against everybody, we weren't discriminating amongst other countries. But when you do a free trade agreement, you are very much discriminating. The North American Free Trade Agreement took to zero our tariffs on, let's say, sugar from Mexico. But whatever our tariff was, and it's pretty high in the case of sugar, it continued to be high on imports from various Caribbean countries that were not part of NAFTA. All right? So not only did that help the sugar farmers in Mexico, which presumably was part of the intent, it really hurt the sugar farmers in those other countries. Indeed, every time you do an FTA, you're penalizing producers in other countries that are outside of that FTA because they continue to have to pay the tariff and the insiders don't. So that is a big problem for these FTAs, and that is a reason why we trade economists are not nearly as positive about free trade agreements as we are about just free trade. We tend to say free trade is good, and I can, if you take my course, show you a number of the reasons for that. But when I do that, it's free trade in a non-discriminatory way. Once it's discriminatory, it's not at all clear theoretically that it's beneficial, even actually to the participating countries, but that's another story. But it's certainly harmful to the outsiders. So this growth of free trade agreements is, I think, a problem. The history of these things is that we didn't have very many of them early on. I've already mentioned the European Union. They, of course, did their customs union back in the 1950s. And actually that led to a number of other groups of countries around the world, in Africa, for example, and I think Latin America, trying to set up some similar things, but most of those all fell apart eventually. So early on, the Europeans were about the only example of successful trade agreements of this sort. And of course, they not only went much further in trying to do it, but they had a huge political motivation for doing it. They didn't do it for the gains from trade. They did it to try to keep Germany and France from having wars against each other, which they'd done twice in the 20th century. So the motivation there really was for security purposes, and it worked extremely well. The rest of the world didn't try to do it much, and they didn't need to because the trade liberalization was succeeding pretty well under the GATT. In the late 1980s, the United States actually, and this was related to the GATT, we were in the midst of a very long, difficult negotiation in the GATT. It was called the Uruguay round negotiation. It's the last one that ever succeeded. But it took a long time, and for a long time it didn't look like it might succeed. And the United States got frustrated, and we therefore, I guess, negotiated a free trade arrangement with Canada, which went into effect in 1989. And then almost immediately after that, and somewhat to my surprise, we decided we would like to do the same thing with Mexico. Now, I think to some extent we were doing this to try to motivate other countries of the world to come to an agreement in the Uruguay round. I think we were trying to say, look, if you won't do this multilateral deal, we'll just take our toys and go home and do a deal with our neighbors. And it worked, I guess, because the Uruguay round did succeed, did end, did create the World Trade Organization. But we'd already started down this path of FTAs, first with Canada, and then we did it with Mexico. We added Mexico to the group, so NAFTA now has all three countries. That was a difficult negotiation, and it was an even more difficult process trying to get it approved in the US Congress. It fell to President Clinton in 1993 to try to get Congress to approve this thing. And he very nearly didn't succeed, and who knows, he knows, but I don't know what political price he had to pay to get enough votes, but he barely got it. But he got it, and so the NAFTA went into effect. And since then, pretty much all since then, although there was a little bit before that, other countries have gotten the bug and have been negotiating free trade agreements also. And here's a graph that the World Trade Organization provides of the number of these things. They are, if you're a member of the WTO and you negotiate a free trade agreement, you're supposed to report it to the WTO, and I've never heard that anybody wouldn't, because why not? And so this is a reporting of the number of these agreements that have been reported to them. There weren't very many early on. This is, you can't read it, but this starts in 1948, and here is about 1990. And there were a few, but not very many. And then it took off. And I won't go into the difference between the different lines and so forth, but clearly it's gone up way. And I don't know if you can read the number there, but the highest number here is now over 500 of these things as of whatever date I downloaded this chart, which probably has been expanded even more since then. So free trade agreements, I mean, there are a lot of them. There really are. For another purpose, I am interested in not only the numbers of these things, but the extent to which they overlap. And so I put together a chart just a couple months ago that you see here. Now, of course, you can't read the axes, and you don't need to. What I've done is I've taken, when I started, I was going to take all the countries of the WTO. That was way too many. So I limited it to about 60 countries. I took every country that is the size of New Zealand or bigger, because I like New Zealand. I didn't want to leave them off. And that turned out to be about 60 countries. They are listed here alphabetically down the side, and the same countries are listed alphabetically across the top. So this is a symmetric matrix. And then what I did is I filled in the cells here, filled in the boxes with the green shading, if they have a free trade arrangement with the other country. So if you could see this well enough, you would find that, of course, the diagonal of this matrix has nothing, because you can't do an FTA with yourself. And around that diagonal, it's completely, or at least should be completely, I think somebody pointed out that it isn't, so I must have made a mistake, symmetric. Because when, again, I can't read them, but if Australia has one with, probably New Zealand, then New Zealand must also have one with Australia. So it should be perfectly symmetric. So what you see here is what it looked like in 1990. This is before the NAFTA went into effect. Were there free trade agreements? Yes, but not very many. Very few, really. And I think most of those, there's obviously a couple of countries that have quite a number of these. I did not include the European Union here. It is not a free trade agreement, it's a customs union. Because I was writing a paper about rules of origin, I didn't care about them. So they're not in there. If I put them in, there would be a lot more green things. And the two countries, I can't even read, I think this is Norway and Switzerland, are the ones that have a lot of green. And that's because they'd done a free trade agreement with the EU. They're not members of the EU, but they had it with the EU. So most of what you see there was that. That was 1990. Now, 5 years later, there were more. 1995. 2000, more still. 2005, even more. 2010, even more. 2013, that's today. It has really filled in. There's a lot, I mean, there's more white space than there is green, but nonetheless, there's an awful lot of overlapping free trade agreements. And the momentum is very definitely to continue this. The WTO not only reports who has notified their FTAs, but they also, some countries, inform them of the ones they have begun negotiations on. And reading the news, I see even more that they haven't told the WTO. So there's going to be a lot more of these things. Indeed, there's two really big ones that I'm in the midst of studying right now for another purpose, and you've probably heard about them. One is the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, the TPA. Wait a minute. What? TPP. TTP. TPP. Oh, I know. It's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's it. I just wrote a paper on it 2 days ago. I should remember that. Okay. Now, yes, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. What is that? Well, that's to be a free trade agreement amongst currently 12 countries on the two sides of the Pacific. It includes Australia and New Zealand. It includes Brunei. It includes Singapore. And a few other on that side of the Pacific. And then on this side of the Pacific, it includes the United States, it includes Mexico, it includes Canada. They were fairly recent additions to it. And the most recent addition is Japan. Are any of you from Japan? Okay, yeah. So you know about this. Mr. Abe. This is one of the centerpieces of his Abenomics, that they're calling it. Is to join the TPP, and I believe now it's happened. They're at the table and part of it. So this is a trade agreement involving two of the biggest countries of the world, the United States and Japan, and 10 other countries, some of which are tiny, but many others of which are quite significant. But it does not include China. It does not include South Korea. So there's some big parts of the world, even in that Pacific region, that are not included. Assuming that happens, that's going to fill in a lot more green up there. 12 more countries, pay all their pairs, right? So 12 times 11 will get additional green cells in there. So there's that. And then, even more recently, there's the TTIP, TTIP. Does anybody know what TTIP is? You're less likely to, given where you're all from. But this is the one between the European Union and the United States. And it stands for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Now, it will be, if it happens, a free trade agreement. So, and it'll involve all the countries of the European Union, of which there are 27, plus the United States. So again, there's going to be a lot, well, actually there'll just be 27 more dots in there, really, the US with all those 27 countries, because the EU countries already have a customs union with each other. But still, if that happens, it's going to expand this even more. And certainly, if both of these current initiatives succeed, then the incentive for other countries, if they hadn't already woken up to the need to do this, they surely are going to think, well, we can't be left out. We're going to have to be part of some of these things, or join them, or negotiate our own, or whatever. So it seems pretty clear that the future is simply going to be more of the same, more and more of all of this. In case you're wondering how the EU fits into this, I do, for one more slide, fill them in. So now the customs unions are added, and it does fill in a lot more of it. And I guess I should probably look at what this would look like once I do the TPP and the TTIP. But I haven't done that yet. Anyway, that's where we're at. These free trade agreements are not unambiguously good. Economists have been looking at them for years, and we are very good at finding reasons why they're not so good. Some of those reasons have to do with discriminating against other countries, however. And if you negotiate separate FTAs with every other country, you're not discriminating against them anymore. Okay? So that aspect of it actually is improved by this proliferation of FTAs. But there's another aspect of it that I've been studying myself, which is these rules of origin. To the extent that the rules of origin prevent you from crossing from one FTA to another, and very often they do, then not only will you not get all the benefits we had hoped for from the FTA, but it can actually, and this is what I've been trying to work on, make matters worse for everybody. We could end up with the world being worse off than it was 30 years ago when we had none of these and just had a lot of tariffs. If the rules of origin are too restrictive and if they distort behavior as much as they potentially could. Now, I don't think, in fact, that that's going to be the case, although I don't know how we'll ever know. I know the rules of origin are going to be bad, but I don't know if they were going to be that bad. In any case, if anybody asks me, and they won't, I'm not going to vote against this proliferation of FTAs. I think it's going to happen in any case, and probably it's going to be more good than bad. But I'm not entirely happy with that, and lots of trade economists are not entirely happy with that. Now, one of the reasons I should really mention is free trade agreements, despite their name, are much, much more, in both good ways and bad ways, than what I've described. Even the NAFTA was much, much more than getting rid of tariffs amongst these countries. And typically, especially when the United States is involved in any of these agreements, we put in a lot of other stuff. We put in rules about labor standards. We put in rules about environmental standards. We put in rules about investment and how you're going to treat multinational, that's our corporations. We do all of this because of domestic interests in the United States that push us to do that. The interests of the corporations, but also interests of the environmentalists and the labor unions. Depending on the politics, it's different balance depending on who's president. But we put all that stuff into these free trade agreements that have nothing to do with the tariffs. We did that with the NAFTA. We've done that with many other free trade agreements that the United States already has, and we are absolutely going to do that in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Indeed, we're bragging about the fact that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to be a 21st century trade agreement or a state-of-the-art trade agreement. And what we really mean, what they say they mean, is it's not just going to be about trade. It's going to be about a bunch of stuff that's really inside these countries. We're going to force countries to do things like honor our intellectual property rights, even more than they already must in the WTO. We're going to force countries to be nice to our multinational corporations that operate in those countries, and on and on and on. So these things have a lot of features, some of which I think are good, but many of which I think are not good. And I wish I could stop the United States from insisting on those things, but obviously I cannot. The kinds of things that are good, though, and I should maybe end on that, and this is something that they're hoping to accomplish in this transatlantic thing. A free trade agreement with Europe, in the way I've described it, probably wouldn't mean very much. Our tariffs and their tariffs are already pretty low. And the things that we worry about importing, where we have high tariffs, they do too. So getting rid of the tariffs between us and them, we're such similar economies, it's not going to mean very much. So what are they trying to accomplish? Well, the biggest thing they're trying to accomplish is, and they're trying to do this in the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well, is called regulatory convergence. And here's the problem. Every country regulates its industries, as it should. It regulates them for purposes of health and safety, most obviously, but lots of other reasons as well. Regulations in a great many industries are necessary and important. The trouble is, every country does it their own way. And once you start trying to have economic transactions across borders, how do you satisfy the regulators in other countries? Well, it may be very difficult to do that, because even though you've gotten your product approved in your country, their rules may be different, and even if their rules are not different, their procedures are separate. You still have to go to their people to certify that you did what they want. And generally speaking, the rules will be slightly different as well. So that really interferes with trading across borders. The Europeans have known this for a long time, and a big part of what the European Union has done amongst the countries there is provide centralized regulations from Brussels that all the different countries have to follow, and therefore it's a single set of rules. Now, it was hard to do, and in many cases it was really silly. Apparently, one of their rules has to do with how crooked a banana can be. If a banana is too bent, you can't sell it. I have no idea where this comes from. So they kind of gone crazy with this. But anyway, between us and them, some of our objectives are very much the same. If we could just agree either on a common set of rules and a single procedure for satisfying them, or on maybe different sets of rules, but mutual recognition, where we would say, okay, if you satisfy the regulators in Europe, bring it on in. We won't ask you to satisfy ours. If we could do that, it would make things a lot simpler. And for a lot of products, that'll probably happen. But there are other areas where it probably won't. You may or may not have heard about the different attitudes in Europe and the United States about hormone-injected beef. I don't know if you eat beef, but if you eat beef in the United States, it's probably been injected with hormones that are going into you. Is that bad? I honestly don't think so. It's apparently exactly the same hormone that the cows make for themselves. We're just giving them more of it, so what's the big deal? Europeans say, oh, terrible, terrible. And they try to keep our beef out because of that. All right? Now, that was a WTO case, and we won that case. And they're supposed to accept our beef. But in any case, it's pretty clear that they have a different view than we do about hormones in beef. Even more important, genetically modified things. Genetically modified organisms, GMOs. Europeans are dead set against GMOs. The United States, well, I think the people, as they are gradually learning about them, aren't so happy about them either, but our government and certainly our corporations think they're fantastic because, of course, it's our big corporations like Monsanto that have created these things, and they're making piles of money producing and selling genetically modified organisms. They can do it here, they can't do it in Europe, and vice versa. So our agreement somehow is going to have to come to a common decision about GMOs, and I cannot imagine how we're going to do that. So I actually rather doubt that and the TPP may ever happen. They're negotiating, but are they really going to succeed? I wonder. But if they could get common regulatory convergence, I do think that would be a good thing, because a lot of those differences just have no really substantive import. And if you could just coordinate them, the world would be a better place. Okay, I'm not sure. I don't think I have much more. Yeah, okay, the future. Well, trade's going to keep on growing. We're not going to ever again, I think, in my lifetime, see a successful multilateral trade liberalization. The Doha round, even if it ends on a positive note, isn't going to accomplish that. Free trade arrangements are going to proliferate more and more, and are going to encompass more and more of the world. Now, what does all this mean for the WTO? Well, if you thought WTO was all about reducing tariffs, then it will be a failure. But I don't think it's all about that. I think it's all about regulating countries, keeping them from using trade barriers to hurt each other. And on that, it has been really quite successful. Not universally, but to a great extent. And so I think the WTO is going to continue to be important and serve a very beneficial role in the world economy. Trade arrangements are going to, a lot of them happen outside of the WTO, which is perhaps too bad, but the WTO will not disappear as a crucial and beneficial organization for the world. So that's my last word. We have, if you want to, a few more minutes for questions. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Do you think that, like WTO overall trade operation will not succeed? Whether that in the future there will be like many FTAs between countries?
I think there will be. Yeah. But that doesn't invalidate anything that the WTO already provides. The WTO already has these rules on how you do anti-dumping, for example. It allows it, but it regulates it, and it prevents countries from doing it too terribly. And indeed, on occasion, they have struck down anti-dumping cases that, for example, the United States has brought, arguing, no, really, the evidence wasn't there. You shouldn't have done it. And then we've removed the duties. So I think that's a very beneficial role that the WTO will continue to play. Okay?
The role of WTO will change to more like a regulation or more in regulating the policies of countries rather than providing a trade platform.
Rather than providing liberalization, a forum for liberalization. Yes, that's right. I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. And the point I felt ambiguous is the difference between like an arrangement of international policy and interference in the internal affairs.
Yeah.
And you introduced the example Brazil and USA.
Yeah.
And the subsidy, granting subsidy to the farmers.
Right.
And to be honest, I thought that's kind of an interference of the internal affairs, because how much subsidies grant to the farmer is it should be made by their own government.
Uh-huh.
And how does WTO have authority to interfere in this kind of decision making? And also, I would say that like what you said, the regulatory conversion
Yes.
is kind of like interference to the internal affairs, like the health problem.
Yeah.
Or the regulation for like finance. But these kind of articles are know how to draw a line of internal affairs and the arrangement for international policy.
Well, nobody does really, and that's the problem. In a globalized world, what you do internally matters for others. So let's go back to those subsidies. We subsidize our farmers. Now, if we didn't export or import agricultural products, that would be completely just our business between us and our farmers, and I guess our taxpayers as well. But that's not the case. For some products, for all products, there is trade. For some of those products, we primarily import the products from other countries. The foreign exporters are therefore harmed by our subsidies for our competing producers because they have to compete with those subsidized producers. And therefore it is, even though it is an internal policy, it's having an adverse effect on people in other countries. Even more important though, and this is where the Brazil thing comes in, is in the products that we export. Okay, we're subsidizing our corn farmers. Most of our corn isn't sold in the U.S., it's sold abroad. Okay? Maybe in Brazil, or maybe in other countries where the Brazilian farmers want to sell theirs. So we're competing with their farmers, whether it's inside of Brazil or not. It's certainly outside the United States. So the effects of our subsidy, the subsidy is paid internally to farmers who are internal, but the economic effect of it is borne by others in other countries. An example that actually contributed to the failure of one of the WTO meetings in Cancun was the cotton farmers. Cotton, make clothes out of cotton, yeah. In some incredibly poor countries in the middle of Africa. I've forgotten the list, but very small, very poor countries in the middle of Africa, which for some reason have an advantage in producing cotton. They can produce it far more cheaply than most people in most places in the world. Now, partly it's because their wages are so low, but I gather it's not just that. But we subsidize our cotton farmers hugely. And as a result of our subsidies, those African cotton farmers not only can't sell to us, they can't sell in the rest of the world because our cotton is being exported to the rest of the world at a subsidized price that is putting these people, well, it's not putting them out of work. They continue to try to be cotton farmers, but they are incredibly poor as a result because they have to compete with subsidized cotton. The cotton farmers in the United States, I don't know where they sit in the income distribution of the United States. They may be poor, they may be rich, but even if they are the poorest in the United States, they're many times richer than the cotton farmers in Africa. So those subsidies are really horrible in the effects they are having abroad. So is it really just a domestic issue? It really isn't. If we could subsidize the cotton farmers and keep them from ever exporting, then maybe we could lessen that harm to others. But we're not going to do that either. So that's the problem. Now, for other things, if we do this regulatory thing, our rules on how, let's say, milk, how pure well, actually, I don't know if this has gotten into the trade field, but we in the United States require that our farmers pasteurize their milk. I don't mind that, but I gather there are people in the U.S. Who would prefer to drink unpasteurized milk. I forget what they call it. And they're not allowed to. It's illegal. Well, that's a rule that I would guess not all countries share. And what if, I don't know that this will in fact be an issue, but let's just suppose that Denmark, which I think has lots of cows, starts to want to sell in the United States unpasteurized milk because it's legal in Denmark, but not legal here. Well, who cares? That's our rule. We ought to be able to make our own rules, right? National sovereignty. And I agree that to the extent that the WTO tries to impose these rules, and to some extent they have in the examples that I gave you, it gets people very upset. Now, when they do this in separate agreements, if the Trans-Pacific Partnership does this, well, each country will have the choice. Do I want to sign this agreement or not? and hopefully they will know what's in it. And if they feel that it is impinging too much on their sovereignty, they won't sign. That, by the way, is another thing I think might happen. Even if the TPP succeeds in getting an agreement, they're then going to have to get it approved in each one of the countries. And I could easily imagine that some of the countries will end up saying no, including the United States, actually. But I see we're at 10:30, so I think we should probably stop.
Well, thank you so much. That's fantastic.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. I enjoyed it.